Hello, everyone. Today, I'm going to share some research on disability and career success, specifically looking at how disability can enable or facilitate an individual's success within their career, advancing into kind of management, executive type positions, and as well how disability can benefit organization level inclusion. Before diving into that, I want to acknowledge my co-authors. First, Mukta Kulkarni at the Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore. Second, Alicia Santucci, who is at the Northern Illinois University. And last, Brent Lyons, who is at York University. And I am Dan Samosh. I'm at the University of Toronto, and I'm also associated with the Center for Research on Work Disability Policy, one of the organizers of this exciting conference. So just for some background to start, what we know about disability and career success. So first off, we know that 1 in 5 Canadians has a disability. This is a really substantial portion of the Canadian population. And persons with disabilities in Canada are more likely to be in entry-level positions in comparison to persons without disabilities. And this, of course, then means that we see lower rates of career advancement as well. So entry into those managerial executive type positions. Now, there are a lot of reasons that have been proposed and examined as to why we might see this gap. And some of the barriers that people experience are things like stigma and discrimination. So perhaps myths and misconceptions of employers and hiring managers, technological barriers, environmental barriers, barriers that start even before someone is in the workplace, such as during their education, and barriers during the school to work transition, as well as many other barriers that someone might encounter. And most of the prior literature kind of focuses on these. We have much less on what are the enablers, what are the things that benefit career success. So in a study that I had published this year, I explored this subject and presented a metaphor that one of my participants first discussed called the three-legged stool, which captures three different things that are necessary kind of in combination for a person to succeed. The first are career self-management strategies. These are things like self-advocacy, building confidence, believing that barriers are something that can be challenged rather than something more absolute. Then you've also got social networks. These can be internal and external to the workplace. And then at a higher level, organizational and societal factors. Things like having a flexible and proactive employer and having programs and funding. So these three things are all kind of needed together to enable career success. But what I didn't do in that study and what we'll explore today is the question of what about disability? Can disability be an enabler of career success? And so this gives us a bit more of an affirmative view, an affirmative understanding of disability. And I'll go into what I mean by that term affirmative now, and then we'll dive into the findings. So there are several different ways to understand what disability is, and drawn from individual experience, and as well as kind of systems that have imposed definitions of disability on people. The first definition, the more historical version that's still used today in medical systems often, is called the medical model, which views disability as impairment. It's an issue of the individual, and sees the problem really as something internal to a person. So this is, of course, can be a very problematic definition of disability when used alone. And so what came about from this was the social model of disability, which separates an individual impairment from the experience of disability and emphasizes that social and environmental barriers create disability. Now, both of these models, which are the most commonly used and kind of considered models, focus on problems, right? The problem is either of the individual or the problem is of the society, of the social environment and such. A third way of looking at disability, which can be used in combination with the first two, is the affirmative model. So this model builds from the social model to look at disability as a form of human diversity. And when we do that, when we see disability as simply an aspect of diversity, an aspect of lived experience, then we can see the potential for positive experience, as well as negative and neutral experience too, by kind of rejecting assumptions of tragedy in the medical model and dependence and abnormality, or kind of these barriers that are everywhere in the social model. So from there, right? We can say we have this affirmative understanding of disability, and not that it challenges the other two, but that it can be used in combination kind of with the other two. We can start to ask, right, how does disability potentially enable career success? So in the research that I conducted with the participants that I spoke with, there were two broad themes that they discussed, and we'll dig into the kind of sub-themes as well. The first theme is that participants would share that in some cases, disability was actually a form of ability. And this presented first as impairment itself being beneficial. So a quote there is a participant sharing that they were in a role that involved a lot of multitasking. And they said that they were constantly being pulled in many different directions. Next, they said, with my disability, I'm like that all the time anyway. So I felt my disability helped me. When I was in that position, within a year, I became a supervisor. So that's the idea of the experience of impairment being beneficial, but also kind of barriers, whether they be individual or social, can also result in the individual learning skills. And those skills can then be used in the workplace. So one participant talked about being in the hospital for a long time as a kid, and that benefited their speaking ability, which they then use later on in their career. So they said, because I was in hospital for so long, it really showed me the power that words can have. Where I had disadvantages in my physical disability, I gained with my speaking ability. And last, specifically, participants who had experienced uh, some sort of acquired impairment partway through their career would sometimes talk about how that experience resulted in some very positive career changes. They might have reevaluated where they were in their career and started pursuing careers that they thought were much more meaningful rather than what they were doing before and weren't necessarily happy with beforehand. And our second theme here is that disability can promote inclusion. So the first theme is about disability kind of benefiting career success. And the second one is about how, at a broader organizational level, the experience of disability can be used by an individual to benefit inclusion within their organizations. So the first thing that I heard quite frequently was that lived experience could lend a certain degree of credibility to the individual that they could then use in advocacy and use it very powerfully to create change within their organizations and society more broadly. So one example of this is a participant who shared that they did a presentation to a group of individuals about elections and voting, and how they presented their presentation was to show just how inaccessible and exclusive these processes were by handing out uh, materials that were all in Braille to an audience that does not know how to read Braille. And so they said, their audience said, well, it's just a bunch of dots. And this participant's reaction was, that is the position that you put people with sight loss in every single election, when all you provide us with is written documentation, inaccessible websites, and inaccessible debates. So this ability to kind of tie in what an accessibility is to personal lived experience and then others' lived experience. In this participant's case, they described that it made the message that much more powerful for the audience. And last, there are also lots of descriptions from my participants that their experience of disability presented these opportunities to share opportunity with other individuals who are perhaps a bit more junior to them, creating opportunities for mentorship and role modeling as well. And this could be with individuals with or without disabilities. In that way, there was no kind of separation. And so what those participants said was, it's more than seeing the heroes and saying, we can all be heroes. No, we can't. That's not the way the world works. It's a nice dream, but that's not how it works. There are these structural things, these barriers. So you create opportunities for people to do things that they haven't done before and see that they can do them. So what are our key takeaways from these two main themes of findings and prior research on career success as well? Well, the first thing to remember is that there are many ways to individually experience disability. Right, we have these various models of disability, the medical, social model, and affirmative model, and many others still. And the reality is that in this research and in lived experience and more anecdotal evidence as well and personal experience, Experience varies. We need to consider the individual ultimately when trying to understand disability, because some people might focus more on their experience of the medical side, others might focus more on social, others more affirmative, and others all three together, and so on. So we really can't use these broad strokes definitions, but try to be more nuanced and remember that all of these things, positive, negative, neutral, have the potential to be a part of the experience here. And so with that, when we're thinking about policy, it's really important to respect the diversity of that experience. So to think not only about barriers or about individual problems, as in the medical and social models, but also to think about facilitators and these positive factors and affirmative experiences as well. So a shift from that wholly negative individual impairment and barrier perspective to also look at this well-rounded view in policy. Uh, it's something that I heard very often from participants, so I wanted to kind of highlight here as the third point, is the importance of managing with flexibility. Uh, Many of the affirmative experiences that participants had, they expressed that they could have because they were in flexible environments, right? And that returns to those three legs of the stool that were described before. Last, right, when I'm talking previously about the opportunities to share, advancement and mentorship and role modeling, those become more available when organizations promote persons from diverse backgrounds. So it's really important to do that if we want to receive these inclusion benefits, to have that kind of critical mass in leadership roles. And the last point I want to make, because we've talked about affirmative experiences here today, is to be aware of positive stereotypes. It's a very different thing to say that an individual's experience can be positive, negative, or neutral, and the array of these, and to say that something like disability is only positive, right? To assume that experience is only good is really caricaturing, and that is in itself an issue as well. So to just remember that although we're talking about affirmative experience, to take that kind of well-rounded view when considering this or implementing it in your own work or life or whatever it is that you're doing. So I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, please let me know. My email is on this page, and it is also dan.samosh@utoronto.ca. It would be great to hear from you. And before the presentation is over, the last thing I want to do is just acknowledge that this project was funded by the CRWDP, the Center for Research on Work Disability Policy, and it wouldn't have been possible without them. So yeah, thank you for taking part, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.